welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. Do I need to correct my PDA child or teen's behavior after the fact? So this is a question I get over and over again in the comments in my social media pages and also within the context of my teaching. So I wanted to take a minute to help you think about this question in a nuanced way, because there really isn't a quote fix or answer that applies to every single situation. So today I want to encourage you to think about 3 questions to help situate this question. And I'm going to touch upon 3 skills that I teach in depth in the Paradigm Shift program and support parents to actually practice and implement these skills. But I want to introduce them to you as a way of thinking about this question because it doesn't have a singular answer. Okay, so do I need to correct my PDA child or teen's behavior when, for example, they swear or they destroy something in the home, they destroy a sibling's creation, they tear up the pages of a book, they call you a name, etc. So I think for a lot of parents who find their way to my page, they understand the concept that I teach, which is for PDA brains, there are sort of just 2 stations of where they're operating from. And if you've heard about zones of regulation, we can draw the analogy of there's really just the red zone and the green zone. There's no yellow zone. It's either they're in the survival brain, which is basically the part of the brain that is operating from a subconscious level and telling the nervous system, hey, keep my body alive, right? And so it's happening faster than rational thought because that is how we have evolutionarily stayed alive as a human species, is to react with fight, flight, freeze, or shut down in order to stay alive. So for PDAers, they're operating from that part of the brain, or they're in the prefrontal cortex, or you can call it the thinking brain, which is where we can access learning, connection, empathy, understand cause and effect, etc. So often when our kids, our PDA children and teens, quote, misbehave, we're still viewing it through the lens of I need to extinguish this behavior, I need to correct this behavior, I need to teach this behavior is not appropriate. And that's a totally natural reaction. However, if we can go back to the logic, we can understand 2 things. 1, if they're activated and the behavior is driven by a survival response, they're in the part of the brain where they can't learn. And with the unique neuroception, which just means that subconscious part of the brain in the limbic system and the amygdala that scans for, am I safe, am I in danger, or is there a life threat, is going to go off anytime you are correcting them, trying to teach them without their consent, or setting a boundary. That's just the way the brain and nervous system of a PDA works, because it's a loss of autonomy by you imposing what's going to happen and you putting yourself above them in the position of authority and the decider. Okay, so if we can wrap our minds around that logic, we can start to understand how to answer this question for ourselves. And just to remind you, the question is, do I need to correct my PDA child or teen? So often when I give examples of accommodation strategy, which is diffusion, right? When a child swears at you and you don't correct them, or you use humor to sort of de-escalate the situation, parents want to know, okay, I can do that in the moment when they're in their survival brain. But when they're back in the thinking brain, don't I need to go back and correct the behavior or explain to them why we can't do that in the home? And this is especially poignant and important when we have siblings, right? When we have other children in the home who are impacted by this behavior, because for many of us, we can understand and accept and take on the responsibility of this nervous system disability as parents. but it's not the responsibility of the siblings to accommodate, right? That's our responsibility. So how do we navigate this? I want to pose 3 questions that you can ask yourself for wherever you are in your journey with your PDA child or teen. And this is exactly what I would ask someone if we were in a coaching container or if we were spot coaching in the Paradigm Shift program. I would ask them to reflect on, is my child in the right part of the brain to receive and process the information? And so many of us are like, well, no, not in the moment. But then we assume they go right back into their thinking brain. And so then we want to teach maybe an hour later or the next day. And this is very natural. Second, if I correct them, will this simply drive them further into the survival brain? And 3, have we laid the groundwork for a conversation that doesn't introduce shame and self-loathing for the PDAer, but also honestly acknowledges the reality for a sibling of the PDAers equalizing? And this is complex, right? And this is why I break things down into skills. And I'm going to touch upon 3 skills with you today. Okay? So in line with that first question, is my child in the right part of the brain to receive and process the information of, like, you know, when you swear at your brother, I know it's coming from, you know, a fight-flight response, but it really, you know, makes him feel sad. Did you see his face? He was crying and upset, right? Which would be a seemingly natural thing to do. However, where I see parents get stuck and where I got stuck in my journey is that I tried to do this way too quickly. And I tried to do it when he was in burnout and before I had an understanding of my son's threshold of tolerance, which just means the point at which he starts to go fully into like nervous system activation and he doesn't have a window, and how much trust have we established, okay? So on those first 2 questions, what you will likely have found is that if you've tried to correct or teach, even a very loving way, the PDA or the next day or an hour later, they're going to be driven further into the survival brain and they're just going to be like, stop talking or growl or throw something, and you have that immediate rejection or avoidance of the conversation. You have that nervous system reaction again. And so we just want to be aware of timelines, right? So if your child is in burnout, and many people who are here have just found out about PDA because their child is either circling around burnout or in burnout. If your child is in burnout, if they're close to their threshold of tolerance for more nervous system activation, and if you haven't established a foundation of trust, meaning you're not going to force them to do things that make their body feel like they're going to die, then any attempt at explaining or teaching is going to push them further away from the ultimate goal, which is long term. And that goal is a sense of felt safety in their body, trust and connection with you, and a window of tolerance for nervous system activation that isn't just pushing them into burnout. So sometimes we have to make the trade-off of not correcting, not just for a day or 2, but like a year, right? And this can be really hard to wrap our minds around because so much of the culture around parenting is like, well, you need to teach your child the values of your home. However, if we can really accept that it's not motivated behavior and it's not a reflection of values, it's actually a nervous system response of my body doesn't feel safe and my body's reacting in a way that I don't feel like I'm going to stay alive. And they're not in the part of the brain where they can access the values that they've learned for you, then we can start to really think about this differently. Okay? So the first skill is decision making, right? And I know parents want solutions, but I don't have specific solutions to what I consider a nervous system disability. I have skills that I can teach you to experiment with and collect data, and then ideas to refine and implement that have been very successful for parents over the long term and their children. Okay, so the first skill that I teach is cost-benefit decision making within constraints. Okay, and you want to understand, is this the time? Is it worth the cost of trying to teach my kid or correct them the day after something difficult happens? Or are they so burned out and there's such a lack of felt safety around me as a parent that correcting them not only won't work, but the cost will push them towards more burnout and less trust. And the benefit, we want the benefit, which is like, oh, they'll learn and I'm teaching them. But the true benefit is that there is no benefit. There's like a made up conditioned benefit of like, I'm teaching them and therefore they'll learn. But we're just putting them back in the survival brain, so no learning is happening, okay? And this is a big paradigm shift. This is a big challenge to implement because the voices in your head are going to be like, well, I have to be a good parent and correct this behavior in the aftermath, okay? And what I'm talking about is, destroying something, and these are examples from my own life, destroying something and then, me not saying anything and just cleaning it up without being like, you destroyed this and now you need to clean it up, or you destroyed this and now mommy has to clean it up and like, I don't like this, etc. Because it's just going to activate the nervous system. Tearing books up, screaming, spilling things, calling me names, growling, destroying his brother's things. Okay? So at the same time, we're talking about cost-benefit decision-making, which is something I teach in depth and requires practice because it's a different way of thinking. We want to separate that from boundaries. Okay? Boundaries, understanding boundaries for a PDA is very different than decision-making. The decision-making is going to tell you, do I set a boundary in the moment or is it not worth it? And it's very different depending on if a sibling's involved or if they're, tearing the leaves off a plant that like actually you like the plant, but it's not worth pushing them further into a panic attack to save the plant, right? And that's unique for all of you. The cost-benefit decision-making includes your constraints, which is something that like we would work together to outline. What are your constraints? What's the cost benefit for your child's nervous system? And then situate it within the family system. Okay, so then let's talk about boundaries. Boundaries is not the same as teaching or correcting. And they often get conflated. And boundaries, I would say, is the primary place where I differ as a teacher and as someone who has their own conceptualization of how to do this based on the hundreds of families I've worked with and my own lived experience. This is the primary place where my perspective differs from gentle parenting, conscious parenting, attachment parenting, and even some other neurodiversity affirming paradigms. Okay? I agree with so much of these approaches because they're based on accepting the child for who they are, connection, relationship, trust, acknowledgement of emotions and respect for the child. However, so often in these paradigms and perspectives, they're talking about boundaries that actually aren't boundaries, because boundaries are what we do in response to a situation without trying to control anyone else's behavior. But when I see people talking about boundaries in the parenting or neurodiversity space, they're saying something like, the parent says, like, we don't do that in our home. And then the expectation is that the child stops the behavior, or you're making them do something, which we all know that for a PDAer doesn't work. Okay, it just doesn't work because of the unique neuroception. And so when we talk about boundaries, we have to be very clear on what that means. Okay, because you standing there and saying like, mommy's having a phone call, I need you to stop talking, is not only not going to work, but it's going to activate them more and escalate the equalizing behavior. And if you're here and you have a PDA kid, I know that you know that that's true because you've experienced it, right? So how do we think about boundaries? This is a skill, okay? So the second thing I want to say about this is that we are caregiving. We are not just parenting, okay? So parenting paradigms can be very informative. However, what we're talking about here is how to stabilize your home and find peace as a parent of a child with a nervous system disability, which includes caregiving, not just parenting. Okay, so for me, boundaries falls into this conceptualization. Let's take an example of me with my two kids, okay? So I have a 9.5-year-old PDAer who's very externalized. He was in burnout at the age of, 4.5 moving into burnout, and then sort of like started his recovery around the age of 6.5. Family's doing well. However, his younger brother, William, who's now 5.5, was the recipient of a lot of very distressing equalizing behavior, meaning the reflexive behavior towards the weakest or the safest person that's like reflexive and destructive or controlling or even aggressive. Okay? So in those situations, and I know this because I tried the other way too, right? Where I would say, we don't talk like that. You can't destroy your brother's things, right? I would try and quote set boundaries by trying to make him do something, which wasn't going to work, right? And I learned this the very hard way. I also tried punishment and consequences, didn't work either. So I've had to learn to think about boundaries differently, which is also how I think about boundaries on my social media platform, in real life, in my business, and with clients, okay? I am never going to try and control other people's behavior. If someone comments shit on my page or says really mean things like you're a terrible mother or whatever, I'm never going to go after them and be like, you can't talk to me like that, or like try and change their behavior. I'm simply going to hit the block button and remove the comment because that's what's my control, right? I have the same idea for the way I interact with people in my life. And this is different. I used to, without realizing it, and with like people pleasing and codependent tendencies, try and control everything around me. Okay? But the same is true for your PDA child. You can never control their behavior. We can only support them to get back into their thinking brain, and with a foundation of trust and collaboration, model for them the values that we want to instill in them, but it requires they're in their thinking brain. Okay? So let's say we have my 7.5-year-old equalizing PDA child accidentally hovering around his brother who's building some Legos, and perhaps I've already encouraged my PDAer to like, let's do some Minecraft over here. You can watch YouTube on the big screen so I can hear the content. But even that encouragement or connect and redirect is activating his survival response because he's perceiving me trying to control his behavior, which is the source of activation. Okay? So then I'm moving into boundaries, which is, what am I going to do in this situation? I can't control how his brain or nervous system works, but I can control my response. So then I focus on the cost-benefit decision-making of like, okay, I can remove me and the younger child. Maybe my PDA will come after me. I can physically place myself between them. I can, set up my younger sibling in a safe place where he can use his iPad, maybe has a treat in the bathroom. I can also choose, if I've already done my cost benefit and understand what the impact will be on the PDA, or I can maybe state the boundary as a signal to the sibling, hey, I'm going to keep you safe, without the expectation that it is going to, quote, work for the PDA, knowing that I'm going to say, William doesn't feel safe right now. I'm not going to let you touch him like this, for example. The difference is between other ways of thinking is that I am not expecting that statement to change the behavior of my PDA. In fact, I know on a deep level, and both like through experience and cognitively, that me stating that boundary is going to be perceived as a loss of autonomy and equality because I'm putting myself in a position of authority, and it will further activate my child. I may still make that decision because the benefit to my younger sibling is enough that it's worth the cost to my PDAer. That's a decision, right? And it's going to be different for you, and it's going to be different if you're in burnout, if your child's in burnout. It's going to be different if you haven't been doing this for more than a month, right? Like if you're reestablishing felt safety and trust, it's really hard to take on the cost of correction because it will be diminishing the trust between you. The way I interact with my child now, 5 years later, is very, very different than I did 2 years ago, even, right? But the radical acceptance comes from accepting like me stating like a value to signal to my sibling, I'm going to keep you safe, is not going to change the PDAer's behavior. In fact, it's probably going to make it worse in the moment. That's a decision. The third skill I want to name, and this isn't a solution, Well, it is somewhat of a solution, but this is long term. Something that we worked on yesterday in the live paradigm shift program was one of a couple things, but I'm going to highlight this one skill because I think hopefully it will plant a seed for switching the way you think about this. The third skill is naming the threat response, not in the moment where your child is equalizing and not even directly, but creating a language and culture around the nervous system in the home so that when you do eventually get to a place where they're out of burnout or not as close to their threshold or you have trust, you have language that is neutral, it is objective, and is not introducing shame, it's not reflecting a temperament, and it can connect to the rest of the family because all of us have nervous system responses. Okay, I just got a question here. So equalizing behavior is what I call the reflexive or impulsive behavior that results from the perception of threat in a PDA. So let's say I set a boundary, or I ask my child to do something. Hey, can you put your shoes away? Or mommy's not going to pack your backpack. You need to do it. And maybe they comply, but they experience bodily and nervous system wise threat or danger. And so to get back to a place of safety and balance, they equalize. Like they might take one of my things and destroy it, or they might start going to follow the sibling to hover around them or call them names. And it's, I think, one of the things that distinguishes PDA kids from ADHDers, for example, even though they have some dopamine overlap. So I hope that's helpful. But let's talk about naming the threat response. And I want to give you 6 steps to experiment with, okay? Again, this is a process to lay the groundwork for addressing the big picture question of do we correct in the moment, and if so, how? So first, the first seed I want to plant with you is encouraging you to start from scratch with the whole conversation about diagnosis, identity, and nervous system stuff. Because often we're conflating those 3, and our kiddos have experienced receiving diagnoses without their input from a position of authority, and sometimes with labels that don't fully describe their experience. And so if you're a parent here, you might, or listening, you might have experienced trying to tell your PDA, or hey, you're autistic or you're ADHD, and they fully rejected it, right? And anytime you try and talk about it, they're like, stop talking, right? And then we're sort of conflating identity, which is a process of deciding what's affirming, belonging, and where we identify, which for some PDA kids is PDA and some it's not. Some PDA kids don't want the label of PDA, and that's fine. So if we can put those aside for now and just think about naming the threat response and the bodily based sensations of the nervous system, we can start to gain some traction, okay? First, start from scratch and separate and parse out diagnosis, naming the threat response, and identity, and allow those to be 3 separate categories and processes. And give yourself permission to not talk about diagnoses if it's not resonating, right? Second, start to focus simply on the shared bodily experience of threat and nervous system response. Okay, so all of us, whether we are neurotypical, neurodivergent, PDA ourselves, all of us have a nervous system and neuroception that is designed to keep us alive as mammals, right? So there is no one on this planet who at least once hasn't had a subconscious perception of threat and their body reacted without their control. Okay, so whether this is, in a work environment when you're stressed out about a superior and deadlines, it could be the moment you realize you forgot to pick your kids up from school and your heart starts to race. It could be almost going through a red light and you feel tightness in your chest and tingling and tunnel vision. It could be more extreme if you've gotten in a car crash or been assaulted or something where your brain perceived threat, right? And it could be objectively out there in the environment where other people could see you almost ran through a red light, or it could be more based on your brain wiring where for me, I had panic attacks in my 20s, I still sometimes do, where I'm perceiving threat that other people can't see. Okay? So the second step is just recognizing that, like, the siblings in the home, the parents in the home, everyone we interact with in the world has a protective nervous system response based in the body. What makes the PDA unique is that what sets that off is more frequent. We often can't see it, and it's specifically linked to the perception of losses of autonomy, freedom and choice, and equality to those around us or the situation around us, okay? So the third step is thinking about creating a family culture and language around the nervous system and coming at it from the side. What do I mean by that? You know, if you're raising a neurotypical child, or think you are, you're going to do the things that I did, which is like, we're going to all sit down and I have my little spreadsheet and we're going to discuss as a family how the nervous system works with maybe a book. Never going to work for a PDA kid, okay? So we can come at it from the side using some of the accommodations I teach, like strewing, declarative language, signals of nervous system safety, etc. That means that you don't want to come head on with your PDA or to try and talk about the nervous system, but rather plant seeds with strewing, which just means like visual or sensory or auditory cues in the environment that introduce them to an idea or concept that they can gravitate towards or reject. Right? It's not directed towards them. So let's operationalize that. It might mean that you start thinking about how your body works in response to the perception of threat. You could think about a time when you were a kid, or a time more recently when you could identify like your racing heart or sweating or tingling in your hands or itching on your skin. And you might do one of three things. You might come into the kitchen while your PDA is on YouTube or an iPad and just muse about like a story that happened to you, right? If you don't have a partner or someone in the space with you. You might tell your partner, hey, I was just thinking about that time when I was like 12 and I, forgot my homework and my heart started racing and I actually got chest pains, period. Right? That's the strew. The sentence is the strew, meaning it's just like a little trial air balloon, right? And we might have some of the conversation with our partner, and maybe our PDA kid comes in and wants to talk about it, and maybe they ignore you, and maybe they shout from the living room like, stop talking about that. Each of those responses is a data point about the pace and timeline of doing this. So if they reject it, you just drop it, right? Understanding that the seed has been planted and you accepting the no is actually signaling safety, and the seed may the seed may bloom, sprout 2 weeks later. It could be starting to talk with a sibling about the nervous system. A book for younger children that has been really supportive in my family and other families is Poppy and the Overactive Amygdala. The movie Turning Red. There's some other strews that we can do. But, it's starting to tell stories and reflect on the specific bodily sensations and waiting until your PDA child expresses interest or maybe names what happens in their body. Right? And then the next step would be potentially naming what happens in your body. Like, oh, when that happens in my body, I call it, a cougar. That's a silly thing because I'm a middle-aged woman. Now I'm laughing at myself. Okay, maybe a lion. A lion. And then maybe they're like, well, I don't like that name. You should call it this. And maybe they come up with a name. So we're starting to name the threat response. So like, for example, my son's threat response is named Venom. Why is this important? This is important because we have a name for the nervous system response that is separate from the temperament, personality, and identity of the human, right? It's a nervous system response. We did the seeds planted. 5 is observe and take data of how your child responds. It could be they gravitate and are interested, they ignore you, and are sort of like their interest is piqued, or they say stop talking, in which case we might wait another month before we try this again. So we're just as like a rounding thing for this skill, which again, I teach much more in depth in the Paradigm Shift program. We want to err on the side of slow. You can never go too slow, but you can definitely go too fast with a PDA'er. Okay? So just to summarize, we talked about the question, do I need to correct my PDA child or teen? We learned that it's important to ask ourselves 3 questions. Is my child in the right part of their brain to receive and process this information? Will it simply drive them further into the survival brain where they can't learn? And have we laid the groundwork for a conversation over the long term that doesn't introduce shame, but it also acknowledges the reality of fight-flight responses, particularly for a sibling? Okay? 3 skills: cost-benefit decision-making, understanding boundaries and what they mean for a PDA'er and caregiving for them, and naming the threat response with 6 steps to start experimenting with this idea. I hope that was helpful for you guys. I hope to see you again soon. Bye. Thanks everyone for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.